Paul, are you mad? I imagine Timothy and Paul's companions in prison yelling at Paul when they realized Paul was sending Onesimus back to Philemon. Are you out of your mind? You're sending Onesimus back to certain torture and death. Do you think your flimsy epistle is going to protect him from the nail, the hammer, and the cross? You're gambling with his life. Now, Paul would have been the first to admit that he didn't know what he was doing. He was just living on faith and prayer. He had asked himself, am I nuts? How foolish is too foolish? And he looked at Onesimus, this man who had become so precious and dear to him, so dear that he called him son, my son. And he looked at Onesimus' face, and it was scared, trying to be so brave, trying to live in this trust. Onesimus was willing to be recaptured. Onesimus was willing to be tortured and crucified to live into this thing that had happened to him. Paul would say it over and over again. In Christ, new creation. He said it all the time. Those in Christ, a new creation. He would say it like that, with that clap. And Onesimus would pray this prayer again and again as he considered what he was about to do. In Christ, a new creation. Now, Paul didn't have to send Onesimus back to Philemon. He could have kept Onesimus with him in prison to take care of him while Paul is bound up in chains. Because Paul still had power. He had become the father, the patron of Onesimus. So he had lordship over Onesimus now. He had protection for him. He was now Onesimus' benefactor. Onesimus found his way to Paul when Paul was preaching in the marketplace. But Onesimus listened to Paul's sermons, hiding in the shadow of trees, slinking about, because he was a runaway slave. If they caught him, he would surely die by crucifixion. He knew what it meant to be a runaway slave. He heard how people, when they would get into these arguments and in a fit of anger, would insult each other and say, well, you're a runaway. The most terrible insult someone could throw was, you're a runaway. Onesimus was a living insult. The bottom of the heap. The worst thing imaginable. He had run away from Philemon's household, from his previous owner, from his service. How did he get this name, Onesimus, which means useful? That's what he was. He was useful. Well, Philemon gave him this name, his useful slave. That's all he was, useful. And boy, was he useful. He took care of the livestock, the farm inventory, even the accounts. He was very useful. So he was a tool. That's what Onesimus really meant, a tool. He had his job, and his job was to be a tool and to be invisible. Those were the norms for slavery. Do your job and make sure we don't see you doing your job. A slave that is visible gets beaten, gets whipped. The only thing worse than being a slave was to be a runaway slave. Was Philemon a good master or a bad master? Well, that's not the question. In slavery in Roman times, the patron had absolute power over the slave, this piece of property. Those slaves were objects, they weren't really people, they didn't have their own destiny. And it was so acceptable to think of slaves in this way. It was so a part of the culture, this whole bottom foundation that lifted up the economy of Rome. It was so understandable that you just keep your slaves in order. Beat them when they get out of line. So Philemon wouldn't have questioned this. This was the air he breathed. And he was the patron. He was the patron of a huge household of hundreds of slaves. And he would beat his slaves just to make sure he kept that was his responsibility, keep the household in order. He had beaten Onesimus. Never even thought about it afterwards. And Philemon had a house church, a church in his very home. And he never would have thought, oh, does my being a part of Christ mean that I rearrange my household? That didn't make any sense. But Onesimus was human, and he yearned to be free. He yearned to make his own life. And so one night, as he was finishing the accounts, pocketed a few coins, waited till it was a deep dark, and then he ran. He ran. He ran. And he knew every step that took him away from the door of Philemon's home meant he would become less and less and less, till by the end he was trash. Runaway trash. He had been an invisible slave, and now he was visible by his very absence. They will be looking for him. And so he hid behind the shadow of trees. He slept in the woods, avoiding as much as possible recapture, because that meant crucifixion. So Onesimus hid behind a tree and listened to Paul preach. Paul was talking about this man named Jesus, this illegitimate son of a Jewish family who also was the Son of God. It was such a preposterous thing, he had to keep listening. I mean, we all know who was the Son of God. This titular title belonged to the emperor. The emperor was called the Son of God. So while listening, Onesimus noticed that this Son of God had a little different, actually significantly different tone. not the Son of God that would come and dominate and gain glory and honor through divine connection. This Jesus, the Son of God, came and died. A runaway slave's punishment. He died like a runaway slave that had been recaptured by crucifixion. This was the Son of God? What could it mean that the Son of the one God would come and die a runaway slave's death? And Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ, and so I rise with Christ. And now I am a new creation. And then Paul continued, all who are in Christ. Now, those who are in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave or free. Onesimus heard this. And this is about me. Good news for me. How in God's name could there be good news for a runaway slave? The bottom trash nobody would care about. And the God of heaven and earth sent his Son to die a runaway slave's shameful death so that he could dismantle this whole structure and say, you, Onesimus, are beloved. You, Onesimus, have dignity in this world. New creation. So Onesimus watched the soldiers take Paul away, imprison him. Of course they would. I mean, what Paul's saying is treason. It's close to treason. If Paul kept talking like this, he would get himself killed. But Onesimus followed and visited Paul in prison. And he told Paul his story about the beatings. And Paul listened. And then Paul found out that he belonged to Philemon. Philemon, whom he had preached to, who is now in Christ. Paul handled his chains as he listened to Philemon describe what it was like to be a slave. The whippings, the lashes. And Paul would grip his chains and he would weep. And he would say, Onesimus, my son, my son. These chains, Paul would pray them like a rosary. What would these chains teach him? What could they teach him? They have taught him more than all the scholars of Judaism, more than all the philosophers of Greece and Rome. He had learned the lessons from these chains. He grew up pontificating the scrolls of the Torah. He was a Roman citizen and he wore a stripe of purple in the marketplace, privileged to walk without fear. All the while, this whole mass of the enslaved that built up the economy, he didn't really think much about them. Until these chains. When he was captured by Christ, he knew the chains and the lashing and the shipwreck and the starvation and the being chased out of town and the threat of stoning. He knew. Crucified with Christ. And there in that suffering, he also knew what Onesimus had to face. Now, in Christ, they were family. My son, my Onesimus. And he also knew Onesimus' dignity, not just his suffering. But Philemon, Philemon, he also loved. And he believed Philemon loved him. You know what's really strange about Philemon? This patron of hundreds, household, villa, all this wealth. And Philemon heard Paul preach. And even with all the honor and glory of being Roman, with being a patron, Philemon found that one spot in his soul that was aching and yearning for something that the patronage system could not give him. And so Philemon also was captured by Christ. There was some dignity beyond this earthly human dignity. And he had come to love Jesus, Philemon. But how much? How much? How much to be in Christ and then new creation? Can this new creation be for real? That a patron would embrace his runaway slave, when the rules of the land would be patron crucifies runaway slave. But now, brother, that's only one step down from being patron. Oh, this new creation. The axis of the earth, it's changing, it's wobbling. Some new arrangement. Can it be? How does one live in new creation? And so, Paul prayed his chain. What shall I do? What shall I do? What does it mean to live as a new creation? And he thought, I will send Onesimus back to Philemon so that we can become this new creation. Send him back. Send him back. So he talks with Onesimus. What do you think? What is this new creation? How will we become it? Shall you go back to Philemon and see if the fidelity in Christ is greater than his entrenchment in this system of patron and runaway slave? Can we imagine the whole world turned upside down like this? Would you be willing, Onesimus, to put your life, your body on the line to see if new creation is possible? And Onesimus prayed. Those in Christ, new creation. Yes, he said, I will go. I will go. And so Paul wrote the letter to Philemon. We read the whole thing today. That was the whole letter. There's no more. That flimsy little piece of paper between Onesimus and death. And so Paul folds that letter, tucks it deep into Philemon's pocket with a shaking hand. And Timothy and the others are like, "You're insane, Paul. You're Onesimus." And they all began to weep as if Onesimus had already died. And with this precious letter tucked in his deep pocket, Onesimus makes his way to Colossae. And now he stood at the door of Philemon's villa. He feels a thrill of trembling in his body. Do I go or do I just jump off the cliff? It would be easier to jump off the cliff. And then he prayed. In Christ, new creation. Philemon is a new creation. I am a new creation. Boom, boom, boom. The guards come. They recognize the useless useful. Throw him to the ground. Time up. A clamor. And Philemon goes to see, what is this all about? Oh, useless, useful. You know, being a patron is not that easy. I gotta beat this guy. Gotta beat him, and then I'll probably have to get him crucified. It's just a lot of trouble. The guards hand him this letter. And he's like, what? What's this letter? And they're like, wow, the slave says it's from Paul. So Philemon retires to his study, opens it up. Is this a joke? This is the worst joke I've ever heard. I don't even get the joke. What? Receive him as a brother? This piece of trash? But he also remembered. And so he called his church to gather. And he opened the letter, and they all read it together. They too were baffled. I mean, what's it going to imply to all the other patrons? But they all prayed. It means something to be a new creation. It means something. So we have this letter today. Philemon, if he had thought, no frickin' way, he didn't have to show anybody. Crumple it up, toss in the fire, get rid of Onesimus. But we have this letter today, and we know how the Bible is put together. The most beloved texts get transferred. The most beloved texts come down to us. And this letter changed the entire community. Not just that. They're like, we're doing something new and crazy here. Let's copy this letter. Send it out to all the churches across the empire. Across the empire, let's copy this letter. Sarah Rudin, the biblical scholar, said that this letter to Philemon contributed to the falling down of slavery in the Roman Empire. The whole empire. 1, 2, 3 people, faith germinating in a church where everyone decides they're going to be the new creation. Think about it. The empire of Rome. I mean, I look at the world today and I can't, it's so insoluble. Our divisions, our hatred, our violence, our cruelty. And yet, we are the church. We have received this letter. Those in Christ. New creation. We are the new creation. We have power we can't yet imagine because it's God's power. Faith, hope, love. And we rearrange the world. Amen.